So I wanted to offer some thoughts here on I.O., the fourth single from the forthcoming Peter Gabriel album of the same name, which will, of course, be released entirely as singles with multiple mixes of each track. I've already talked about the first three tracks from the album in a separate video. I've talked a little bit about the various mixes, determined that, as far as I can tell, there's not a huge amount of distinction in the different mixes, so I'm comfortable really, offering thoughts about the song right now, just having heard the first version that's out there. As always, I'm Hans from Electric Brain, Electric Shadow. If you're fond of progressive rock and things influenced by it and sort of quiet, dark, moody music, check us out on Bandcamp or your favorite streaming service. So one thing that I liked about this song is it's built on a very effective piano line, not unlike the third single, Playing for Time. And that piano line has a little bit of an off-kilter quality to it, and, in some places it echoes the vocal line, while in others it kind of weaves around the vocal. Now, it's played repetitively enough that it almost feels more like a loop than like something that's being played through. I wouldn't have minded a little bit more variation in the playing. I think that might have made the track overall a bit more interesting. I think about something like The River by PJ Harvey, right? That's a song that's based on a very simple piano phrase, but it's played with all these little kinds of variations that really kind of bring the track to a lot more life. Here it feels more like a MIDI file that's being copied and pasted. I don't know if that's literally what's happening. I'd imagine somebody probably just played the whole thing, played the thing the whole way through, right? But it doesn't really have that sense of any kind of liveness. That being said, it's still a pretty effective piano line in spite of that. The first two songs didn't really have a characteristic instrumental element that was kind of a core that provided a lot of identity, right? They had a lot of layers, but all those layers were kind of texture and tone, and they lent some sonic depth without really lending distinction. As far as other parts of the sonic construction, I really like the guitar harmonics under the verse. That's a lovely touch.
Stuff coming out, stuff going in. I'm just a part.
And again, feels a bit more human, a bit more live than a lot of the material that we've had from this album. As a matter of personal preference, it's also nice to hear some reasonably live-sounding drums, right? The drum tone reminds me a bit almost of Gavin Harrison, or maybe really more like, if you had an Easy Drummer pack for Gavin Harrison, right? If they had like an Easy Drummer Gavin Harrison expansion library, which I would totally buy and use, by the way. Now, the instrumental section under the chorus, that feels a little bit blander. It has some of that sense of hollow uplift that kind of bothered me in the coda of the last single, Playing for Time. But, that's not a deal breaker, particularly because the vocal is quite effective here. I really like that vocal technique on the end there. I can't quite tell if that's falsetto or just him using the very highest end of his natural range.
I'm just a part of everything.
But, it echoes techniques he's done in the past. He's always had a very evocative way of throwing in those very, very high notes. And it's cool to see him use these kind of identifiable habits and techniques in ways that feel characteristic but not stale, As far as the lyrics go, I think it's a reasonably effective lyric. He's taking this term from, like electronics or communications theory and using it as a metaphor to evoke the unity of life. That's a reasonably interesting idea. It also seems like a way of coming to terms with mortality, which I'm sure is, a relevant and poignant subject for him right now. Some of the lines about, the elephant's trunk and the octopus tentacle and all of that being all of us.
We all belong to everything, to the octopus suckers and the buzzards.
It makes me think a little bit about the line, the song, what is it? I Grieve. There's the line, life carries on, and all the dogs and cats, and all the flies and the rats. I remember, my mom's a big Peter Gabriel fan, and when that album came out, I remember her citing that as a particularly clunky lyric. And I've always kind of agreed a little bit, honestly. You could say here that he's either repeating himself with those lines, I suppose, or you could say alternately that he's using a similar technique to express an idea more effectively. whether you want to see that positively or negatively, it's up to you, I guess. Thinking about it in relationship to the song Panopticon, though, it's really interesting that you have these two songs about total interconnectedness, right? And one of those is about the interconnectedness of life and the life cycle. Then the other one is about this kind of technological interconnectedness and the kind of involuntary, informal surveillance state around that, right? So, you have these two songs about total interconnection, one of which is very kind of spiritual and positive, one of which is probably dystopian. So, the spiritual version and the sinister version, the way that those mirror each other's, right, as in versions of the same concept, I like that. And I think it makes both of those songs much more interesting lyrically and conceptually in conversation with each other than they would be in isolation, which is maybe a downside of releasing the album piecemeal as singles, although I guess we are still able to make that connection now. So overall, I like this track. I mean, it's catchy, it's emotionally authentic, it's got at least one interesting, distinct instrumental layer, it's got a good vocal performance. Feels like a reasonable addition to his legacy. There's a sense of let's say, lightness and sentimentality that's shown up particularly in his covers and soundtrack work lately. And, that side of him hasn't really had much of a representation in the kind of full albums of original material, right? So, I guess it's good to see the canon kind of being expanded to incorporate that aspect of his writing as it's developed in the last decade or so. And this is a reasonably good instantiation of those tendencies. That being said, the production and the arrangement, they still have this quality where, it doesn't have the vitality and the detail of something with a real sense of liveness, but it also doesn't really have any kind of genuinely interesting or surprising soundscaping, right? You do something that's really live and you have the benefit that comes, like the warmth and the detail that come from having a full band. You do something that's totally synthetic and you can do some really interesting noise making and soundscaping. And it's like the style of this album, the style of all these songs, is in this liminal space where it doesn't really have any kind of definitively organic or synthetic quality, which keeps it from really maximizing the advantages of either of those approaches. For some reason, listening to this album has made me wish he would be a little more stylistically risky, right? I think about the first solo album, and you just have this kind of constant parade of, hey, it's a barbershop quartet, right? Hey, well, it's a waltz, but just for one verse, And listening to this album kind of really makes me miss that weird grab bag quality, particularly of that first album. And, eventually he evolved beyond that into kind of using electronics to make a very distinctive and personal sound space. But now the whole world's caught up with that. And, the tools he's using do kind of sound generic a lot of the time. And, maybe this is presumptuous to say, but listening to these songs, it almost feels like the reason he hasn't released an album in 20 years is because he's like paralyzingly afraid of risk taking. But, enjoyable music has emerged in spite of all that, particularly this and the last single. And I will be interested in hearing more.